Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Bread of Life channel. I'm here with John Maddox tonight from the channel Logical Plausible Probable. Am I saying that right?
That's right.
Am I doing it backwards? Okay. Anyway, John is actually one of my favorite YouTubers because I just think he does such a great job of communicating truth to people in both with scientific topics and with philosophy. And so I'm just thrilled to have you on tonight, John. So welcome.
Oh, well, appreciate you having the invite. I know you'd asked me a while back, and I've been crazy busy this past month, and I was even forgetting to email you. So I apologize for that, but I'm very excited to be here, and hopefully we can have a great conversation and, share some different things from my life, my journey, as well as just hopefully things that will resonate with people who are searching for, a greater understanding for their, for their own lives. And I in no way, shape, form, or fashion claim to be, some kind of, Nostradamus or, crazy philosopher or intellect, but at the same time, I have spent quite a bit of time, especially this past decade, looking for answers for myself, and hopefully we can relay some of that information to other folks.
Cool. Well, will you share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I call myself a serial entrepreneur. Started doing that in college, and then got involved in tech. I studied business, but then got involved in tech after that, and a couple different ventures. One was a software development company, and where I had to learn all sorts of stuff about software and tech and information technology and communication theory and a variety of other aspects, which ended up, taking me down the rabbit hole of what we're going to be talking about tonight in relation to DNA and the application of, communication theory and all those different aspects into, biotechnology. But what really kind of led me to, ultimately where we are, the reason we're having this conversation right now, is in my late 20s. I had my software company, and I was sitting in my office with I think he's a billionaire now. He's very close to a billionaire then. And my world faded to black, and I woke up in an ambulance. And very long story short, turned out that I was having a massive brain hemorrhage and ended up having emergency brain surgery to save my life. And in the ICU, between the time of finding out of, hey, you're having a brain hemorrhage, and hey, we're going to be operating on you to see if we can, keep you from dying. I was laying in ICU by myself, and one of many neurologists that was curious about the fact that I was still alive came in to talk to me. And I was like, hey, doc, so, what's the deal? You're like the sixth one coming in to talk to me about this stuff. What's the deal? Am I getting billed for your time too? And being a little bit smart aleck. And he's like, no, not at all. Not at all. I just, well, do you want to know the truth? And I said, well, since I'm going to have brain surgery tomorrow, it'd be nice to know what's going on. So he pulls up my MRI that I had at this point and shows me. He's like, hey, see this? And he pointed to a gigantic glow. And I said, I assume that's my brain hemorrhage. He said, yeah. And he showed where different parts of the brain it was overlapping on. And he's like, one of the reasons we're so curious about you is the fact that a gigantic portion of this hemorrhage is in the portion of your brain that controls verbal communication. And you're sitting here being able to carry on high-level conversation with us, and that doesn't seem normal, as well as the fact that given the size of your hemorrhage, you should be dead in the first place. And not long after that, he left, and I was laying there contemplating what I had just been told. And I'd also had some other information on the size of my hemorrhage, the rate of survivability, all that kind of stuff. And out of nowhere, I remembered a promise I had made God my freshman year in college, which was that for a decade, I was going to go out, make as much money as possible. I was going to willfully go do what I wanted and basically be the kind of equivalent of the prodigal son, if you will. And then in a decade, I would get my life right. Well, as I was laying there thinking about this, I realized that it had been almost 10 years to the day from when I'd made that promise. I had forgotten it up until that point and had no intention in rectifying my life, if you will. And in that moment, I immediately recognized that, number one, my promise was being called, and which is ironic because I'd been a bit of a gambler as well. And my bluff had been called, I guess, by God. And that in line with all that, though, he was giving me a second chance. And not only that, he had left me with my greatest skill, which was my ability to communicate. And just as I'd been told by doctors, hey, you shouldn't be able to talk right now, and yet you are. And in that moment, I realized I'd been given a second chance, and a whole bunch of crazy stuff happened after that. But that was the catalyst for me of, okay, it's time to go and begin searching and looking for answers to find out whether A, your conclusion that God exists is correct, and then B, find the evidence that correlates with it or stands against it. Because, once you've faced your own death and the realization that you are mortal and that at any moment everything that you think you are could be taken away, it forces you to really contemplate things on a much bigger scale, in my opinion. And I became very fascinated with how many people weren't. So that's the long-winded, short version of kind of what's catalyzed me getting into some of the things that we're talking about tonight. But it was an interesting time in my life, but I wouldn't change it.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that. And we're going to be, our main topic that we're talking about tonight is DNA evidence for God? So what did you find when you started looking at DNA? What do you think people should know about DNA?
Oh man, there's so many things. One of the primary aspects is that the genome, the deoxyribonucleic acid, that's the chemical medium that is the container of your genetic code, the regulatory sequences, all the different aspects that control the nanotechnology that enables you to exist. And when you realize that the underlying necessities for all forms of life to exist is digital information, digital code that is so incredibly high tech that up until relatively recently, we didn't even know what to look for. And our technology was not advanced enough to know what to look for. And with my background in the software development world and all the different things I had to learn about all these different facets of it, both from a application perspective, the software creation perspective, the transmission of the data, all those kind of things. Since I already had that knowledge, as I began to become curious about, what are the necessary requirements for my existence, and started looking into these things and coming across all these papers and books on this topic. And I recognized the direct application of the two. And I'm not the first one to do this, by the way. There's plenty of others well before me who had recognized this. And but to me, when I saw it, I was like, wow, okay. Well, this is even more incredible than I thought it was. And I guess what I would say to the audience is, if you haven't gone down the proverbial rabbit hole and gone to look at this for yourself, do not accept the talking points that you hear from me, from atheists, from anybody else. Go and read it for yourself. Go understand the basics of information and communication theory, and then go read the papers on how all those things are applicable directly, not metaphor, not analogy, to genetics. And then begin to contemplate what are the known underlying necessities for those things to exist in any other context. And once you begin to analyze things through that prism, you're forced to ask yourself significant questions, not just about, what's it do? And more into what's the origin, let's talk about the ontology, is this evidence for teleology, all those different things that people want to avoid. So that's kind of, I guess, a short like a nutshell of some of the things you really need to contemplate and why my curiosity was piqued so much.
All right, well, boil it down for us. Is DNA evidence for God?
I think so. At a minimum, at an absolute bare bones minimum, I think that it is evidence for an intelligent agent being necessary. So when you think about that logically, if per the conventional paradigm perspective, consciousness did not exist prior to the evolutionary stage of, abiogenesis all the way on up till relatively recently, the whole premise that we think about of consciousness and intelligence wasn't really around, right? So if the components that are necessary for not just DNA as like molecule to form, but the sequential information that's contained therein to be put into place, if that requires a intelligent agent to act and to create it, then obviously the intelligent agent had to precede life. Well, if what precedes life? Well, you have to have something that is not bound by the laws of physics and chemistry that we're bound by, right? So then you're having to get into, well, what is information? Is information immaterial? Is there, can the syntax be physical medium? Yes. Is the semantic value, the meaning of the symbols? Well, those are arbitrarily assigned values. So we're getting into the immaterial, right? Then you get into the pragmatics. What kind of modifications do we make in relation to the context of something? Well, well, that gets interesting. And then you think about aspects of communication theory. We have a encode message decode, right? You have an information source that gets encoded into a source alphabet, then it goes along a channel, and then it gets decoded. Well, how does decoding happen? Well, the only way you can decode something is if you understand what is the original and what it's being turned into, right? So, for example purposes, if you speak English, you're in a Spanish speaking country. Nowadays, we take for granted, like, oh, I can use Google and listen to somebody talk, and they can translate it for me on the fly and things like that. Or I can type in something in English and click translate, and it goes into Spanish or Chinese or French or German or whatever you want to do. However, that wouldn't work unless the system that you're running that sentence through understood both the syntax, semantics, and pragmatics of the English language, as well as whichever one you're translating into. And you can't just have one without the other. So when you look at what is happening in relation to protein synthesis, for example, where you have a DNA sequence that's translated into an mRNA sequence and then translated literally, not figuratively, by the ribosome into the amino acid. So you now have a source and a target alphabet. You have the source, which is the DNA. You have the target, the codons are the source alphabet, and you have the target alphabet, which is the amino acid that it's equal to. So one of the things that people oftentimes, well, atheists I've debated on this, insist that what I'm about to say is not true, when it's 100% true, and I will bet you whatever you want that every expert biochemist will agree with me on this, that the codon, which is the set of 3 base pairs, which is equal to an amino acid, there's 64 of them, that equal 20 different amino acids, and start-stop commands. The codon does not chemically interact at all with the amino acid that it is equal to. Okay, it does not chemically transform into, it does not chemically interact with the amino acid. So you have a true symbolic representation of a source and a target alphabet. You have a 3-to-1. You have 3 nucleotide base pairs to 1 in a specific sequence equal to an amino acid. Or you have something like AUG, which is a start command. So when you put this in context of information processing technology and computation, right? You have command lines, you have start, stop, all these different things, right? And if you don't have them, nothing that our conversation would not occur right now if there weren't multiple source codes, right, as well as translation mechanisms that know both sides of the code bases that are being utilized. We wouldn't be able to have this conversation right now. There's no telling how many dozens of times the information that's coming out of my mouth, going into my microphone and crossing fiber optics and everything else, or Wi-Fi signals, all those kind of things, is being encoded, message, and decoding. It's happening over and over and over again before it gets back to your speaker and goes in your ear. Now, modern humans take this for granted, but it's a fundamental. And the exact same logic applies to biological systems, and not just in genetics, but in a plethora of other ways. But the point being, then back to the why does this mean God is the likely conclusion, is unless you want to argue that your source code, and in this context, machine code, all the way down to the machine code, the DNA is the equivalent of a machine code, all the way up to the entire system that transmits it. Unless you want to argue that all of those things it's plausible, those can come into existence without the necessity of an intelligent agent to precede them. Unless you're going to make that argument, and that somehow the technology that enables us to talk could somehow create itself, unless you're willing to make that argument, which some atheists are. It's quite fascinating. The intelligent agent preceding is the more logical, plausible, and probable conclusion. It's kind of the part of the reason for why I named my channel what I did, is unless the conclusions you reach are logical, plausible, and probable, then you're living in a fantasy land. And to me, when you look at genetics, when you look at the nanotechnology that are proteins and maybe all this crazy stuff, you look at the fine-tuning of the universe and all these other factors, you don't have to just look at one and, oh, well, this is the only thing that proves God, right? You can look at it from a tapestry or a mosaic perspective and say, when you put all these together up on the wall, I now have this beautiful picture that showcases to me that the logical, plausible, and probable conclusion is that a preceding agent must exist. That must be God. Because whether or not you want to, doesn't matter which religion you want to apply to this at this point. It's now, is it the right conclusion that a God exists? And then from there, if that's true, now the logical thing to do is to go analyze the religions and find out which one best holds up from an analysis of that, and then conclude from there whether you think was it Allah, is it the Hindus and all their gods, is it the Christians, is it some version of Christianity, all those different things that come into play that very often people want to just either accept on face value or just reject on a very myopic scale. And that's why I think people need to go do a little bit more digging for themselves. Otherwise, they're making very superficial conclusions and rejecting the existence of God out of hand versus being like, this whole argument about faith, I don't feel like I have to have much faith to conclude that God exists. And DNA is just one of the many examples of why I think that's the correct conclusion.
Yeah. So what about, like, there's so many people who believe that DNA developed by natural processes. So what's your response to that?
Well,
what's the problem with the DNA, coming about by natural, just on its own?
Well, first off, what most people don't realize is that in the current secular study research, DNA, they don't think DNA created itself. They think that something else had to come first before DNA could have possibly come into existence. So I remember seeing, they got the whole RNA world hypothesis. There was a thing for a while that had some, it was PNA, peptide. Yeah. And then you get into peptide nucleic acid. Then you get into the most recent one I've seen is like I think it's Xeno, it's XNA. And basically it's like a synthetic thing that's been created. Like, oh, well, this thing that we've created doesn't have to have enzymes. So if we don't have to have enzymes, then potentially it could just, we can just remove all these barriers from the equation, right? The problem is that with all of these different models they come up with, they don't actually have any explanation for how you would get. It's like, okay, we know that DNA is too hard. Like, that's not going to happen by itself. So we got to come up with some precursors, right? But then they come up with precursors and then don't actually come up with explanations for how it's plausible that you could have, well, for some of them, they haven't come up with a plausible explanation of how those came into existence. The precursors came into existence without, some additional factors. The whole not prebiotically plausible is the common term, right? So pre-life, would this be able to create itself? No. Well, we created it in a lab. So yeah, but you guys did. And you did it in an environment that you freely admit is not prebiotically plausible. So what the heck relevance does this have to the overarching question of how did you get to DNA? Whether or not you want to have hey, I can come up with something that's not DNA. Congratulations. That's like you figured out how to make XYZ, but you needed to make ABC. What's your point? There's no real significance, in my opinion, to this stuff. And, very often it's put forth with such, surface level confidence. And when you actually go and, look behind the curtain, as they say, you find out that, like, so this isn't even remotely as close as the headline said. And very oftentimes even as close as the headline of the paper says. Not, and I say paper, I mean like the thing that's in the peer-reviewed journal. You read the headline or you read the title, and then you go read the paper and you get to the conclusion. And it's like, well, what we discovered was our experiment was not, we were able to pull off XYZ, but it was not prebiotically plausible. But the title was, is this a new answer for, prebiotic, blah, 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 blah. And I'm not saying they're necessarily doing this, out of untoward reasons, other than maybe trying to get more funding. But very oftentimes the journalists seize on it, run with it, and they write an article that's all, they don't necessarily say, hey, they've solved the problem, but there's like, they could have, or does this indicate, those kind of things. And people don't think about it. And very often,
Right.
And I've interacted with many atheists on YouTube about this topic, I hear them spewing talking points, and I'm like, if you read the end of the article, you'd find out that wasn't what was actually claimed. And so all in all, the DNA question has not been answered. You have, Eugene Koonin has an H-index. He's a very high-level evolutionary biology researcher, and just the necessary components for the transcription factors to be able to replicate DNA, I believe the improbability he came up with was 1 in 10 to the 1018th power. And to put that in context, the total number of actions, like total number of atoms interacting, all that kind of stuff, all the particle interactions in the universe, assuming a 13.7 billion year timeline, you have no more than, I think it's 10 to the 121st. So if you don't have any, you literally do not have enough probabilistic resources available to you to account for the improbabilities of just creating the necessary components for the replication of DNA that we observe. So to me, when you look at that, so basically you're coming up with things that say, mathematically, there's no way this is plausible. I'm not seeing evidence from the chemistry perspective that says it is plausible. I'm actually working on things that aren't even actually what we have to account for. And I'm freely admitting that I'm not. Yet somehow we're supposed to be convinced that concluding that the preceding intelligent agent was the requirement is not the more intelligent conclusion, the inference of the best explanation. And to me, when you really look at these things, my inference of the best explanation is that we have people who are adamantly against the premise of God being the necessary requirement, and therefore are going to cling desperately to materialism and exclude any and all alternatives that contradict materialism and determinism. So, I mean, let's think about it. It's very basic. If God is required, or a preceding intelligent agent is required, then dogmatic tenets of materialism collapse immediately. And now you're left with idealism or dualism being the more rational position to operate from versus materialism and naturalism. So, anyway.
Yeah, well, I mean, it seems clear, we don't have scientific observations of codes writing themselves, right? We know if we see a code that an intelligence is behind it, right? And I've heard you talk about that. And then where I hear the conversation often go is, well, it's not really a code. So how do you respond when people say DNA is not really a code?
Oh man. Well, there's so many layers to that. So first off, there is a plethora of papers that are directly on the topic of it being a code, and not a figurative one, not a metaphor, not an analogy, etc. And I have quoted from them many times. They're written, the ones I quote from on purpose are written by people who are not creationists. They're not ID proponents. Actually, all of them are atheists and are trying to come up with, publicly say they're trying to come up with ways to account for this, basically other than that, right? Like, well, we know that's not it, but we have to account for this, right? And, but beyond all of that, from the point of, it's a well-established premise inside of academia in biochemistry. The philosophers try to argue over it, and very often some things are quoted from, like philosophy papers. Oh, well, the metaphor, and they're thinking about it from the ontological perspective, right, versus what it actually is in relation to from a communication and information theory perspective. And what I've found is that the vast majority of the individuals who make the claim that it's not actually a code don't actually understand the basics of communication theory. And they don't know what that code mapping means, or source to target alphabet, or block codes, or alphabets, or strings. They don't understand any of these concepts. And if they did, they would be like, oh, I'm an idiot for claiming that it's not a code, when it literally fulfills all of the fundamentals, right? And I mean, there's paper after paper written on this of them comparing the genetic code to other codes. So how is it remotely coherent to claim that you are, this is like peer-reviewed stuff, right? I'm doing a comparison of the genetic code to other codes to find out which one is more optimal. Then they found out, it turns out the genetic code is like a 1 in a million optimization in terms of code logic and code theory. But it's like,
what does that mean? What does that mean? A one to a million optimization. What does that mean?
No. So the optimization is like the best. It's like a 1 in a million in terms of the overall efficiency, and like how optimal the data transmission is from a mathematical perspective. And because you're looking, okay, so with information theory, you have you're calculating the number of bits that can go through a channel, and then you're looking at the channel capacity and things of that nature, right? But that's only like step one. And this is where a lot of people showcase their ignorance, as well as, or just refusal to go and do an analysis. And they're going to make arguments like, oh, the information in DNA is nothing. It's just like, it's just raw information. Well, that's called raw Shannon information. It's just the calculation of the number of bits, which you're calculating looking at the nucleotides. Each one's the A, C, T, and G are the base pairs, or sorry, the bases of the alphabet, right? So just like in English, you've got A to Z. In binary, you have 0 and 1. With the genetic code, you have a quaternary or quaternary, depending on whether English or different pronunciations. That means you have 4 alphabetic bases in this context. So you have digital representations, right? And in this context, we have the chemical molecules are the digital representatives of the alphabets, of the alphabetic characters. What many people, well, if we're into the communication theory part of it, one of the standard talking points that I heard it last week on the Talk Heathens show from a guy who claims to be a doctor, which blew me away. It's not information, it's just chemicals. Well, one of my biggest frustrations with this whole topic is how many people are unaware of the premise that the medium which contains information has zero relevance to whether or not something is digital information, right? So I could write, hello, Rebecca, looking forward to seeing you tonight for this interview, right? So how can I send that to you? I could send you an email. I could send you a PDF, which you download and print, and now it's on paper. I could upload it to Google Drive and send you a link. I could take a picture of it. I could write on a piece of paper, take a picture, send you the picture. Or a week ago, I could have written this down, put it in an envelope, and sent it to you. Right now, the information from the English language is the same in all this from the symbolic representation perspective. However, there's a whole bunch of different mediums that potentially can contain it, right? Or I could have sent it as a fax if anybody still has fax machines, right? And it could have come in that manner and then printed on a piece of paper in that fashion, right? The information took on a plethora of different forms from a medium perspective. There was the transmission medium, but the information stayed the same. And in the context of DNA and genetics, we have, like right now, humans are investing billions of dollars into utilizing DNA as a digital storage medium, as well as we're creating DNA-based computers. Like, this is not hyperbole. I'm not making this up. This is not like future, maybe this might happen. If you don't believe me, Google it. Google DNA computers, DNA data storage, and you will find that every major tech company on this planet is investing ridiculous sums of money into digital data storage in DNA. Why? Well, they figured out, Watson and Crick, started this whole deal, that turns out there is, a gene sequence is digital information. And so the fact that we are, this earlier point I made about, doing comparisons to other codes, finding out it's optimal. Then, hey, we got digital information. Hey, we're doing digital data storage. Hey, we're doing digital computation with DNA-based computers. We're creating read-write mechanisms. Oh, wait, why? We're copying read-write mechanisms that we see in biological systems, and we're trying to take advantage of it in our own technology. So this whole argument of whether or not it is or is not a code is so outdated that it's one of the reasons I give some of the atheists I interact with such a hard time, because I'm like, you guys are like 30 years out of date on this topic. And if you think I'm wrong, go take it up with Microsoft. Go Google the genetics lab at Cambridge University, which is where Watson and Crick discovered DNA. It's considered like the pinnacle in the world. And go find out who is the title sponsor of it. It's literally Microsoft. Do you think that Microsoft, which has spent who knows how much money creating a read-write machine that can store digital data onto a DNA strand, do you think they're doing this for fun because it's just a chemical? No, they're doing it because they realize it is the densest data storage medium that we're aware of. And I mean, all that stuff. So the point I'm making is biochemists and biophysicists and computer scientists and very rich people and very educated folks all conclude that it's a code. It's not even argued over anymore, except on YouTube with atheists specifically. And Cy Gart, who you had on a couple weeks ago, he actually did a series. It's one of his pet peeves, by the way. And he's a PhD
here right now. Yeah.
Oh, is it? And he did a whole video series on this exact topic because it irritates him to such a degree that he's like, you know what, I'm going to do one just for that. And hopefully we'll educate these folks. And well, we'll see if it hopefully a whole bunch of us can all get together and educate the YouTube universe.
Well, now, why is it important to them to not let it be a code?
Well, I think this goes back to the point I was making earlier of if a code necessitates if the formation of a code and for specified information necessitates a intelligent agent in order for it to exist, then from the atheist worldview, the second you make that concession, then everything about atheism collapses. Now it's just I hate God and I don't want God to be true, and I don't want to have the accountability on all those different, the cascade effect of the ramifications of if God exists, then what must I analyze about my own life and my own approach and the things that I am contemplating and different activities I'm engaged in, whatever it may be. I'm in no way, shape, form, or fashion judging, oh, you're a bunch of sinners. And like, we're all sinners, right? We all do things that are wrong. I know I sure have. But ultimately, I think outside of what I just talked about, the other thing would be a lot of them have been so adamant about it not being one or just being an analogy that I think there's also a pride factor, to be honest, of I've been talking so much trash for who knows how many years, telling all these people like myself, you don't know what you're talking about. You're outside of you're not an expert. You don't have a PhD in XYZ. Therefore, every argument you're making must be invalid, all those kind of things. And even though I've read from paper after paper on this topic, it would necessitate admission of guilt, if you will.
Well, now what about that? Because, there's many scientists who are saying, hey, this had to happen by a natural process, or we don't have it figured out yet, right? But like they somehow are not recognizing that there's an intelligence behind it, whatever their explanation happens to be, but they're not recognizing the intelligence behind it. So what qualifies you, John, to stand against what some people like to call the scientific consensus? Is there even such a thing? And do you think that there is actually, a scientific consensus that DNA could come about by natural processes?
Well, I mean, there's more than a few well-respected individuals who have said otherwise. So it's not like I'm alone. Now, many others, I mean, I'll use Eugene Koonin again as an example. H-index 266. For anybody who knows what H-index means, that means he's not some random Joe. Okay. His conclusion for how all this could be plausible was the multiverse must exist, because that's the only way you can remotely account for all of the improbabilities, right? And moreover, in terms of DNA specifically, to my knowledge, there is no consensus on how it could have come to be. There's always, different hypotheses, but they're not right now. And Dr. Gark can, attest to this even more than I can. But to my knowledge, there's not really too many people are actually trying to research DNA. They're all focused on the precursors because they recognize that DNA is not really something that's plausibly created without something prior to. Right? Because, hey, we need enzymes, we need all these different things. And oh, crap, the more enzymes we have to have, the more improbabilities we have to account for. And, okay, well, we all recognize there's not enough probabilistic resources available for this to be the starting point. So we've got to go back a ways, right? And, to me, it's like, I don't really, the consensus on this topic, which, like I said, I don't think really exists regarding DNA and even regarding the precursors, because it changes on a regular basis. I mean, even RNA world's kind of on its way out too. There's like hybrids of RNA world that are being created because they're now realizing that RNA world by itself not really plausible either, even though that's been the major focus for the last 25, 30 years. But ultimately, in the context of why I don't really, the consensus on this doesn't really interest me until they account for the information problem. You have to account for arbitrary value assignment. You have to account for the source and target alphabets. You have to account for things that in all observed examples have, it's not that most of them have or some of them have, all known examples to compare it with have necessitated an intelligent agent. So if the ones that are necessary, what's necessary for the genetic code, which everybody agrees is necessary for life, the only way that would be plausible is if it's the only one, the single most important one, somehow created itself. Like there's some natural process that creates the only example that didn't require an intelligent agent. So when you look at this from a probability perspective, it's like, who's actually making the more sound gamble or the educated guess in this context, right? This goes back to my days of poker, right? Like, okay, if it's on the flop, I've got king, queen, the flop is ace, jack, 10, and it's two hearts, and I have two hearts in my hand. So now I have flopped the nut straight, and I have a potential royal flush redraw. I'm willing to put all my money in the pot in that context because the odds are in my favor. And if I've got, in this context of codes and such, I've got a 99.999 percent probability that an intelligent agent was necessary based on the observed evidence. And the irony for me is that the ones who claim to have the most confidence, and I'm the one who is relying on faith, are actually the ones who are relying on the 0.0, who knows how many digits out, one. And to me, that's why it's like, I don't understand why people are so hesitant to make these arguments or so, concede so much. Well, I guess it's totally reasonable. There could be something we haven't discovered yet. And I'm like, well, that's true hypothetically, but the evidence is not in swinging in that favor in that direction. If anything, it's going the opposite direction. The more that we learn, so.
Right. So this isn't an example of like God of the gaps. We don't have a nice natural explanation, so we just want to fill in God. It's actually the opposite. It's that what we observe actually looks like there was an intelligence involved. So to say that it's not is actually going against, I mean, it's the probabilities and like it's an implausible scenario.
Absolutely. And the other thing that one of the other aspects that gets talked about a lot, and you hear it ad nauseum, is it's just physics and chemistry. Well, there's papers, one which I've read from many times, that go into the details about, from an empirical standpoint, they have shown that the laws in physics and chemistry do not determine the code. It operates under them, but is not determined by them. So you cannot just say, oh, it's just pure chemical affinity that makes the code do this. That's been completely and utterly obliterated for quite some time. However, it's a standard talking point by some of the most well-known atheists. They continue to make that argument over and over and over again and dismiss everything. And what's your definition of information and all these different things? Like, what are you talking about? And then you start to pin them on information theory and communication theory, which most of them don't have a clue about. Then they spin over to it's just physics and chemistry. And it's like, well, no, it's been proven to be arbitrary from a deterministic chemistry perspective. So, are you claiming that all of the papers on this topic are invalid? And the vast majority of them never even have a response. It turns into a deflection and go off on a different topic. But that's why I say in this context, if people go down the proverbial rabbit holes, you find out that the position that all of this is not just plausible from undirected process is the much more, in my opinion, rational conclusion.
Well, why do people go down that path of questioning what is information? Why do they want to challenge your definition of information?
Well, I think it's probably because many of them have just heard that talking point of it's not actually information, and then they want to apply some aspect of one of the definitions has to do with like conscious agents communicating back and forth, which is very ironic given the fact the second definition has to do with the representation of things based on sequences. And like the Oxford Dictionary actually uses genetic information as the example of what information is in that context, right? So you have just the baseline definition of the reduction of uncertainty, right? That's one aspect of it. But then you're getting into the point I was making earlier about the representation, right? So you can calculate just the number of bits that you're working with, but then you have to get into what does it mean. And with in Claude Shannon's 1948 paper, he actually makes the whole point that that initial math portion does not account for the meaning of the information, and that from a pure mathematical perspective, you're not being able to determine what the information or what the representation values are. And those are things that's why I say we get into communication theory of code mapping. So a great example is Actually, you know what? Let me share my screen. I'll just show you guys an example of this.
Sure.
Make it easier. See if we can pull this up real quick. Okay, can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, so this is like a thought experiment. But so let's say you've got 3 different cities. You got city A, city B, and city C, and you're wanting to set up a system to let the different cities know what the projection is for the weather, right? So for city A, you're going to make sunny be 0, 0, rain to 0, 1, cloudy is 1, 0, and foggy is 1, 1. Okay, and you're doing that, and you for that city, the probability of sunny, rainy, cloudy, foggy is 1/4, right? So you have a 25% chance of it being one of those, right? Now you've got city C, who's sending the similar information to city A, right? So for them, sunny is 1, 1, 1, 0, rainy is 1, 1, 0, cloudy is 1, 0, windy is 0. Now, why would you want to map it out like that rather than do it the same way? Well, that's where the probabilities come into play, right? So that particular city, from a weather perspective, sunny is 1/8, rainy 1/8, cloudy 1/4, windy 50%, 1/2, right? So if you're trying to improve the efficiency of the information being transmitted over a channel, you would want to reduce the number of bits in order to transmit the information you're going to send on a more regular basis. It's just like with other things where like E is is the most used letter in the English alphabet, right? So you would have a digital representation of E that would be less than Z or X because it's much less probable that it will be used. And so when you're getting into that whole optimization question you were asking about earlier in relation to the genetic code being compared, that's one of the things that we're looking at, right? Is the representations of values in this context, codons and amino acids, is the probability, the way it is represented, more efficient, less efficient, equal to other systems, right, or other potential codes. So anyway, I won't go into all the details on this, but there's many other examples of this, and you can see I'm doing some of the math on how you're being able to reduce the number of bits per message if you have more efficient code mapping. And this is like a fundamental of communication and code theory that people get into. But because the vast majority of people in the modern era are not, we're now in the drag drop environment, or people are only using higher level languages, which a higher level language example would be like PHP, Java. Those are higher level languages. And what we're talking about is on the machine code level, the zeros and ones. That's what that is translated into. And so very often, because the term code in the modern era, people immediately think of something like JavaScript, right? And they're like, or PHP or whatever, like there's no literal if. And it's like, well, I understand that, but in your computer is not actually, translating the English letters if when it does a command, right? Or it looks at a variable. It's reading the zeros and ones, which are in this context are represented by different volts or non-volt or impulses, right? Electrical impulses. Well, we can do the impulses in a variety of ways. It could be light, it could be electricity, it could be taps, it could be flashes of light if you're doing Morse code, all that kind of stuff, is what you're accounting for in relation to your code mapping efficiencies, as well as the overall optimization of your code itself. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that there's plenty of papers on the machine code aspect that I'm talking about. And it's why I get frustrated with a lot of the atheists who make all these arguments about, the higher level languages. And it's like, well, ultimately, the argument still applies because you have extensions of the strings of letters, which now are the symbols, which now equal into this command. But you can, if something is actually a code, it can be translated into another one. That's the whole point. That's what makes it. You can translate it to something else because it's representative of something else, right? So theoretically, you could always apply. You could make up some other alphabet to represent that code, just like we have how many languages on planet Earth, right? pretty much everybody's got some code word for apple. It can be totally different in different languages, but it still means apple, right? And if it's a code, you can translate it into a different language if you know what it means. And anyway, not my long-winded diatribe on that one, but it's there's a lot more to it, but it's kind of the surface level aspect.
Well, you mentioned something interesting earlier about, and I'm probably going to mess this up a bit, but you were talking about how like DNA utilizes physics and chemistry, but it's not like it, I guess basically like it's not the way physics and chemistry work do not like naturally make DNA happen. I don't know. Explain what you mean by that. Do you know what I'm talking about? I'm not expressing it well, and I knew I wouldn't.
I think so. So, okay. So if so first off, it's recognized that from a chemical affinity perspective, basically the order of
okay, that's what I was looking for.
The order in which the base pairs get in order in sequence, right, is not determined by chemistry. If it was, then we would just see patterns all over the place, right? Versus completely arbitrary orders from a chemistry perspective, right? And now there are portions of the genome.
Like if you had I'm sorry, I want to stop you really quick to just kind of, for those who don't like have a science background and may not know what you're talking about, are you giving an example? Like, for example, we see crystals or like molecule arrangements that happen naturally because of the way chemistry works, but DNA is not like that because it's not like a natural formation that would happen chemically. Is that what you mean?
Sort of. You're correct on like the snowflake argument and the crystals and all that kind of stuff. People use it all the time and claim that that's the exact same thing. It is not. In terms of what we're talking about now. I'm drawing a blank on. There's actually a term for that. See if it comes to me. But anyway, there's actually papers written on why it's not. The whole snowflake and crystal deal is not even remotely applicable to DNA. There's multiple papers on this topic. I got some. That's why I'm mad at myself for not being able to draw this name up. If you go to my folder that's available to everybody, there's multiple papers on this topic in the folder. But okay, so if there was just like pure patterns of things based on chemical affinity, then we would see, even if they were long, we would see, the same sequence over and over and over again, right? And there wouldn't be all of these just completely arbitrary, random alignments, right? And here's the thing: is if it was determined by that, then we wouldn't be able to have all of the plethora of like millions of unique sequences that equal things, right? It would be impossible for this to happen because you would just have repeats. And the irony is that we do actually have things like called short tandem repeats, for example, where it is a short repeat of something, but not only does it have significance, we're discovering things like, oh, this actually has relevance from a physical three-dimensional structure perspective. Things we thought were just this, purposeless junk DNA does nothing. Oh wait, turns out there's actually like physical, it's like hinges and all these different things that fold the genome or the chromosomes into different alignments. And now we're getting into crazy stuff like, and one of the things that blew my mind when I learned about this was the inter and intra chromosomal gene regulation. So we're finding out that there's like physical three-dimensional folding that takes place. In very many cases, these short tandem repeats I'm talking about are part of it. And it literally folds into a position where something else from another genome or another portion of the genome, another chromosome, combines with it. And then that's where the regulation and the expression of that gene happens. So you have like spatial, temporal logic and controls that have to take place in a three-dimensional space in order for these things to be expressed. And then back to your point on the patterns and such, it's like, you guys are still arguing over patterns. Like number one, this is an outdated talking point from quite some time ago. And number two, all the stuff we're discovering completely obliterates the relevance of the argument you're making anyway, because it's like, so you want to claim that a pattern is what accounts for spatial temporal regulation of an expression of digital information. Like that's what we're arguing over now. And that's, again, to repeat my earlier point of, it's one of the reasons I get kind of irritated sometimes. I'm just like, are you willfully this ignorant to make these kinds of hyper confident arguments and dismissals of the points that are being put forth, when even staunch atheist, outspoken atheist, origin of life researchers won't go this far, because they know that what they're discovering shows the polar opposite of talking points like, oh, it's no different than, a crystal, and snowflake. Oh, there's a bunch of snowflakes. What is that? It's anyway. Sorry, I can go off on that one for a while.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that you have the papers listed, and if you guys go to Logical Plausible Probable, you and John's channel is linked in my description, so please do go check it out, subscribe, and if you want to see any of the papers and things that he's talking about with this, he has like a link where you can just there's tons of articles and stuff there, so please do that. And so one of the things you mentioned is, well, we don't see all this repeating within the DNA, but one of the things that I often hear, atheists and materialists talking about is the similarities in DNA, and that, they do kind of often talk about it in terms of, oh, it's just the same information duplicated, and like basically kind of that they're giving that as like the scenario of how all these different organisms came about. So like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's a variety of thoughts. And real quick, I'm putting a link to that folder in the private chat. Okay.
Cool.
So the similarities, as we all know, one of the fundamental talking points is universal common ancestry, right? And phylogenetics and all the similarities mean that by default we must have descended from, universal Luca, right? Well, there's multiple reasons why I don't dismiss the premise that there was descendancy, obviously, because that's obviously true. But the claiming that because there is a similar sequence or sequences in different organisms, that therefore they must have evolved these sequences and these similarities through heredity and such. To make that argument requires you to not actually know, to contemplate how we do technology, right? And how frameworks work. So, for example, I remember we used to use the CodeIgniter framework, right? When we were creating custom applications and such. There's tons of frameworks out there. And if you were doing a code audit and going through and looking at something, and you had 10 different applications that were all written using the CodeIgniter PHP framework, right? Then you would probably have 90+% similarity in code, because there's all this stuff happening in the back behind the scenes that's not what the humans interacting with on the front end, right? That is controlling all these like normal basic functions and connecting to databases and APIs and login functions and all this like basic stuff, right? And from a development perspective, you would be fired if you insisted on recreating all this stuff from scratch every time. You would be considered an idiot. And because you'd be wasting time, money, energy, resources on recreating something that already exists, right? So one of the other aspects of the evolutionary argument that's used supposedly in favor of it is the universal genetic code. And it's like, okay, so you're claiming that because they all use the same code, therefore this means they must have evolved, therefore the similarities that we see must be proof of evolution, versus the premise that the same code base was used, the same framework was used, it would make sense to see a lot of similarities. And if we're looking at the information theory aspect, the communication theory, the software aspects, the OSI 7, that's a whole other topic in terms of like data layers and stuff that are applicable both to our systems as well as biological systems. Unless you're willing to argue that we can suspend all of the intelligent agent action in order for the variations, even between two software applications that are, the code would look 90% similar, and there's 10% that's the completely custom portion. And I'm making up these percentages, but like developers will understand what I'm talking about. And it's the same thing. One of the examples I use all the time is like a contact form on a website, right? If you're going to argue that because on website 1, you have first name, last name, email address, and phone number in a text box on one, and then on the other one, it's got that information as well as, you're setting up an appointment, you're inputting all this information, you're uploading video clips, for an interview or whatever it might be, right? Oh yeah, no. Because they have like 45% of the code is the same in that function. Therefore, the more advanced function came from the similar one, from the simpler one. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, okay, I might have like copied part of it, but there's no way I came up with all these new functions arbitrarily, right? An intelligent agent could do it, no problem. In a very short period of time, they could expand it, right? And again, in the context of development, if you didn't go and Google or go to GitHub or somewhere and be like, I wonder if there's a script that somebody's already built that does most of the basics, and then I can like customize it for what I want to do. If you're not doing that, then again, you're either don't know what you're doing or you're getting fired very, very shortly for not being efficient. And so to your whole point of the similarities, I'm like, okay, so let's get back to the improbabilities and let's look at what actually has to happen and what's the plausibility of the survival going for these major steps. When we know that, point mutations can result in death, and very often do, and some of the worst diseases are mutations not even in the coding portions for protein sequences, they're in regulatory portions of the genome or of the DNA, right? And that's also something else we haven't talked about is, people want to focus everything about the similarities on the coding regions, but that only makes up like 2% of the entirety of the genome. What's the other 98% doing? 97%, whatever percentage you want to use, right? And it's like, we're now realizing that there's all these regulatory functions that are going on in these portions that aren't the quote unquote coding regions. But then we're finding out that there's other layers of code, like the histone code, for example, that is being utilized. And there is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There is information processing that's going on in relation to the histone code. And then a couple weeks ago, I had an interview with Dr. Ben Galt in relation to what he's discovered in relation to the mesh code theory, which I won't bore everybody with the details, but that's a whole other code, right? There's like, I think it's 37. I think the number's 37 different recognized biological codes. We haven't cracked all of them yet, but we now have the ability to recognize that they exist. And so, in line with the overall point of like, what do you say to people that argue that genetic code's not a code? I'm like, well, at this point, that one's already established. We've identified all these other ones, and we're trying to crack them. So are you saying that all these people that are doing research trying to crack the other ones, are they like out to lunch when they write papers about code theory application to whatever it is that they're studying? And they're hiring computer scientists and information theorists to come in and work in conjunction with the biochemists and the biologists of different disciplines to figure out how this stuff works. And they're applying the premises of these different disciplines into biological systems to figure out how they work. Well, why would you do that if that wasn't what you needed? Like, if you weren't trying to figure out how that works, why would you need an expert in that field to figure out how something works, who knows the principles of information communication theory as examples? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So what about this idea that your good buddy Mike put up here from Answers in Atheism? Yes, and almost 90% of DNA still has no known function. What are your thoughts on that, John?
Well, I think there's researchers that would disagree with you on that. I suggest you go read Dr. Nessa Carey's Junk DNA book on this exact topic, talking about how individuals such as Answers in Atheism are out to lunch on their positions of that, and they dismissed the ENCODE project and these different things that found way higher percentages of biological function. They're like, oh, well, we don't know what it does yet, therefore it has no function. And it's the same thing with, oh, pseudogenes, it's junk, it does nothing. And then they're finding out, oh, it turns out pseudogenes are doing all sorts of stuff, we just didn't know how to look for it. And then we're finding out, oh, different portions that we thought were just junk copies and didn't have any relevance, turns out that they're in vivo active based on cell type. So we've been looking in the in the lab under the microscope, and we're not seeing any, it's not doing anything. Oh, wait, turns out it does do something if it's alive and it's in this specific cell type, then this portion is heavily active. And there's all sorts of examples about that. And I don't know, that in the same thing with this whole 90% of the genome doesn't do anything talking point. It's very similar to the it's not a code argument. It's outdated, and it's a living, breathing example of the desperation of the atheist to avoid the obvious and to continue to cling to their positions that it doesn't do anything, when it's like, okay, we'll see, where the evidence continues to be coming out in my favor, not yours. So we'll see. As I said earlier about being a gambler, I'm willing to gamble on that one, because all the papers that keep coming out are saying things like, because of the staunch arguments about it having no function, research has been limited and prevented, and technological advancements in order to enable us to do higher level analysis of this have been hindered by those who are arguing ad nauseum that there is no function. And that's actually in several papers. That concept is in several papers. They were published in January 2020 on discoveries in the junk regions of the genome, specifically in relation to cancer. And it's actually very interesting. A huge portion of the diseases and cancers that are being identified, we're figuring out that they're caused by modifications to the non-coding, supposedly non-functional regions of the genome. So, a change happens, something breaks on it, and then you have XYZ disease, but you claim that this doesn't do anything. Well, I guess we know it did do something, right? So, as that evidence in line with that logic continues to be exacerbated rather dramatically, as every couple months as new things are published on the topic, like I said, I'd prefer to wager in the favor of us continuing to find more, not less.
Yeah. Well, let's take some, if you guys have any questions, and I'm not going to be able to scroll through the entire chat because it's quite lengthy, but if you guys have any questions for John, please put them up now. And we will ask him whatever you guys have in mind. And I would also love to hear from Cygart about that junk DNA, if you want to make a comment about that also. So I'm just kind of looking to see if there's anything. There were some questions earlier, but it's hard to find. So, well, I don't know if this is a question. Plastic happens naturally, not determined by chemistry. Do they draw straws? I think these are all responses to people. So sorry about that. Okay, I'm just going to see if there's any questions here. All right. Well, anyway, so nobody's putting up any questions right now. So I want to just go back really quick to the proposed mechanisms, because we were talking about the RNA world hypothesis and some of the other ones. And Cygart put here about the junk DNA, bread of life. I agree with John. So, there's another person with expertise.
So you say Dr. Gart was responding to my point about the junk DNA. Is that what that was in response to?
Yeah, he was saying he agrees with you, about, what you were saying about the junk DNA, that we're discovering that it is not non-functional or junk. And so I wanted to ask about, these proposed mechanisms. the RNA world hypothesis that, both you and Dr. Gart are saying, hey, that's like on its way out. Nobody believes that anymore. Well, are there any proposed mechanisms that have observational science to back it up? Anything on how DNA could have developed?
To my knowledge on DNA, no, other than like just, crazy hypotheticals of like if this and this and this and this and this and this, then yeah, there's been some of those, but most of that, and Dr. Gart can clarify this more because he may know something other than I do, but to my knowledge, specifically on DNA, everybody's kind of like scooted away from that one because of it's not really the implausibility of it is so extreme that it's kind of like, are you actually trying to spend time on this kind of thing, right? Which is why they're going to the precursors, right? And now they're coming up with different hypotheticals, and some experimental stuff on like, oh, how could we form nucleotides, and could we somehow figure out a way to work around the need for enzymes and things like that nature for different replication aspects. But even in those cases, when you actually go down and look at them in more detail, you find out that the scenarios which are being presented as supposed, steps, if you will, aren't actually prebiotically plausible. And it's like, or not actually what's being presented as, self-replication, all these different things aren't actually in the same context as what we're talking about and what we take for granted in terms of what we observe in life now, right? So we're still going back to the hypotheticals that don't actually explain what we observe and what we recognize as necessary for life to exist. And I mean, there's different hypotheses and different people. Okay, well, I could see how that might happen and go down. But then the irony for me is that you then run into, it's like, okay, even if I can somehow account for maybe kind of sort of account for this, then the environment in which that one is plausible or maybe plausible is the direct antithesis of what this other component would require. So you then get into the whole aspect of, well, how does A join with B if A cannot survive where B is, and vice versa, right? Oh, well, then we need, a shield for that one. Okay. So again, if you say that A can only form in this environment, and then it needs a shield in order for B to interact with it, but then B in your plausible explanations for its formation has to be over here. How does it physically get in the timeline you have available to you before it degrades and all that kind of stuff, right? And decays. How do you account for that? The physical proximity that's required, because we're talking about molecules here, folks. Like the molecules in my microphone, from a distance perspective, I mean, it's who knows what the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of miles, right? In terms of the molecules that are on my lip versus on the microphone, right? So are you claiming that just because something happened, where you are, that if the other person was on Mars, it's actually plausible they're going to be able to connect and like build something together? I don't think so. And this goes back to the whole aspect of what's plausible and what's the more rational conclusion based on the known barriers to the equation and the recognized improbabilities and all these different things that come into it. And then it's like, we have atheists who are claiming that somehow we're the ones who are blinded by a God of the gaps bias, when it's not even, we don't have to come up with the math. Like the math is come up with by people in your camp that recognize the implausibilities of all this. So
yes. Doki says Bread of Life. Does LPP recommend, like, what are your recommended books on DNA? Audible books or
actually, so on my channel, I actually recently started putting this a list of some books that I like. Let me pull it up real quick. I can tell you a couple. If you have questions about some of the basics of why DNA is a code, I recommend Evolution 2.0 is a very good one. So it's both an audiobook and a normal one. But that actually gets into a lot of the stuff on telecommunication principles, information theory, communication theory, the applications to DNA, and the genetic code. And the author of that paper, I mean, he operates from a he's not like a young Earth creation of anything of that nature. I mean, he looks at it from a theist perspective, but also take into account like, hey, theistic evolution can be true, all that kind of stuff, right? Let's see. The junk DNA is a very interesting one. Evolution 2.0. Why there's more to the human genome than meets the eye. I think that's a short version of that is deeper genome as the short version of the name, but the subtitle is why there's more to the human genome than meets the eye. Was a good one. Signature in the Cell by Stephen Meyer, phenomenal book. And I wager that the vast majority of the atheists on YouTube have never read that book. It's a thick one, and it goes into incredible detail about this topic.
If there are any atheists watching this, sorry, I think we on our thing, so I keep like really interrupting you. But if there's any atheists who are watching this who want to read any of the books that LPP just mentioned, I will buy them for you. So email me. I will buy you any of these books. You will read them.
I love how.
Sorry, I interrupted you, though. Go ahead.
No, you're fine. You're fine. I think it's funny that Mike's saying try Karp's molecular cell biology, where you can read preacher books, your choice. Yeah. So again, a lot of the books that I recommend are not written by Christians or preachers. So just like the papers that I often look at are also not. So that ad nauseum talking point about how it's just nothing but biased resources is categorically false. And again, we have another example of individuals who don't actually go and, well, I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
I made you promises that I would be.
Natalie.
Good.
On your best behavior, you're not going to get salty tonight.
Exactly.
So Natalie says, is it reasonable to argue that claims the DNA code is the result of natural processes unscientific, as there is no precedent that even low levels of information have occurred by chance?
I would think so. I mean, you can try and use a scientific method to determine whether or not it is something that can be accomplished through natural processes. But I guess I would just say that the scientifically derived evidence indicates that the opposite is true. That it would not be the result of just natural processes unless you have an intelligent agent manipulating the natural processes, right? And that's the kind of the point I was making earlier about the let's see if I can find that. Just read it. The not being determined by the physics and chemistry. Let's see. This paper, yeah, okay. This is from a paper called titled "What is Cell Biology?" It has taken a long time and much experimental work to overturn this conclusion, but eventually it has been shown that there is no deterministic link between codons and amino acids, because any codon can be associated with any amino acid. And then it lists off all these papers. This means that the rules of the genetic code do not descend from chemical necessity, and in this sense, they are arbitrary. Today, in other words, we have the experimental evidence that the genetic code is a real code, a code that is compatible with the laws of physics and chemistry, but is not dictated by them. So I repeat that. Today, in other words, we have the experimental evidence that the genetic code is a real code, a code that is compatible with the laws of physics and chemistry, but is not dictated by them. Our problem, therefore, is to take stock of this reality and to account for it. So this is why that's one of many examples of this, but what I just read is one of the reasons I get so irritated with people, arguing over and over again that it's just chemical processes and all this kind of stuff, when there's empirical evidence to the contrary. And given the fact that with the atheists, we're usually dealing with people who demand empiricism in every facet for anything they're going to remotely even contemplate considering and maybe concluding is correct. And then it's like, well, here's the empirical evidence that says that your talking point is false. And then like, well, what's your definition of information? That's the kind of like spins they try to do. It's like, well, and you go down that rabbit hole, and then they want to deflect and not actually address the when you get them all the way down to the root of the question, it's like, okay, well, if you're going to concede that it is this and this and this, then what is the more rational conclusion of how it came to be? Through undirected random chance, which is what you run into, or the actions of an intelligent agent.
Mm-hmm.
And then even if you want to get into from an evolutionary perspective, even if you want to argue that when you have a completed system that evolution could take place, even if you want to argue that, you still have to get to that point. And the barriers to getting to that point are so nuts. It's like, okay, so you're arguing, if we're arguing that if a quantum computing system with the most badass AI program of all time was able to create robots, a la, Skynet style from the Terminator, right? If that was true, are you going to argue that Skynet created itself? Even if Skynet had the capacity to create the Terminator, ultimately, are you going to argue that Skynet created itself? Because that's what we're talking about here. And unless you're willing to argue that Skynet created itself, then you have to reinsert the necessity of the intelligent agent back into the equation.
Yes. Well, Assembly of God has a question for you. Good segue from what you just talked about. Let's say a person accepts a creator of everything. How can you show them that it is the Christian creator? Oh, the Christian creator, John M. Oh, you got me. Okay, so I think anyway, but go answer that question, even though he's making a bit of a joke, kind of that I think he's trying to say that you think you're the God, the creator, which I don't think John Maddox thinks he's the creator. Right, John?
Nope. I've argued many times that I in no way, shape, form, or fashion view myself to be superior in any way, shape, form, or fashion. So, and I also recognize my inferiority would not enable me to be God. Therefore, since we don't have the capacity to even create life, it would not make sense for me to think that I was God. So, but in the context of the Christian God, I think there's multiple facets to that, but I would say in relation to one of the standard atheist talking points of like, why wouldn't God show himself? Why wouldn't God make it obvious for, which one he is, all that kind of stuff? And I say, well, Jesus Christ took on flesh and dwelt among us and shared that he is God and showed that he is God and created the mechanism for us to reconcile with God, with himself. And so the claims that there is no evidence, right, on many factors, it's like, well, are you just ignoring it? Because it seems to be a trend. We have a trend of, the genetic code's not a code. The nanotechnology and the nanomachines that are proteins, all these different things that enable us to live, they're not really machines. It's just chemical reactions. It's not arbitrarily assigned data values and all these different things. Like, it's like, okay, so now you say, well, why, if there is a God, would it be the Christian God? And it's like, well, I mean, there's people who've been outlining this for 2,000 years at this point, as to why the Christian God is God. And yet you're still regurgitating the same talking points. And now in the modern era, we've got the mythicists who are running around claiming that Jesus didn't even exist. And it's like, okay, so you're telling me that we literally define human history based on the birth of the individual you claim doesn't exist. Okay. Whether or not you want to agree that he's God or not, to argue that didn't exist that's such a incredible leap of faith that anyone who claims that the Christian requires more faith versus the person who believes that nobody named Jesus ever existed. I mean, that's like I don't know. I have a hard time taking those people serious, to be honest. And I know that a heck of a lot of atheist academics in the subject also don't take those positions seriously. So it's like, if you're questioning whether or not there's any remote arguments in favor of the Christian God, I think that would just indicate that you haven't actually gone and looked, and you're potentially operating from you may be an adult, but you're operating from a very juvenile mental perspective.
Well, John, that I guess wanted to ask you, what is your motivation for your channel? Why do you start your channel, and what are you to accomplish by like sharing this info on YouTube and doing debates?
Well, what got me into it, I was randomly on YouTube and I came across the Atheist Experience, and I was listening to Matt Dillahunty go off on a tangent full of a lot of the talking points we've been discussing tonight. And I was so blown away. I looked and saw there's like, there's 5,000 people watching this. And everybody's like, I'm looking at comments, all this kind of stuff. And I'm looking at the brainwashed regurgitation and support of things that I knew beyond doubt were just false. And not false from the Christian perspective, false from the scientific perspective, right? And so the following week, I called into the show, had a conversation, and I won't go into all the details. Let's just say that it got fiery, and the manner in which our encounter went really ticked me off. And I'm one of those individuals that I'm very chill and laid back until you really get under my skin, and then you better watch out because I'm coming for you. And anyway, in line with all that time frame, I was doing all the searching around, looking at different stuff. I came across the Modern Day Debate channel, and I was listening to some of the debates on there, and I was hearing the exact same things being regurgitated again and again and again by all these different individuals. And I was like, what is happening here? This is insane. There's like a whole internet commune that's going on with all this stuff, and people are being convinced over and over again of these things that are false, right? So I started looking into some of the like deconstruction stories. Different people on YouTube have huge followings talking about why they stopped believing in God and all those different things. And I noticed a trend with many of them that one of the talking points they issued were these things about, or one of the reasons they kept issuing were these different talking points that we've been discussing, right? Oh, that's why I know that God doesn't exist, right? Yeah. And so I kind of identified like, there's a plethora of people who are being influenced by false information or skewed truths, and it's not only is it crushing people who have faith, it's also preventing others who were searching from finding answers. And so long story short, I started getting me involved and did some debates and some other things. And then I had one of the mythicists came after me. It was kind of funny. And that was the catalyst that got me doing more videos. And then the rest is history. Now I've become slightly addicted. I enjoy it very much. I like talking to people, and of course, with the lockdowns and everything, it was a entertainment facet and things that really gave me something to do during all the madness of 2020. And fast forward to now, like I said, marginally addicted, but also see the bigger picture and the potential benefits, not just from the finite existence I have now, but from the eternal. And that's what ultimately drives me.
Cool. So just for those who are watching, and I thank you for the atheists who are watching and watching John's channel, watching my channel. And we do want to provide you reasons to believe that Jesus Christ is the Savior of the world. We want you to be saved. We love you. And that's my motivation. And that's, I love my atheist audience. So I just, I'm tomorrow announcing the atheist of the month for the month of November. So please come. We're going to have Sal Cordova on, and he's going to talk about what to do when you have doubt, like cures for doubting Thomas is what he's calling it. And I will also announce Atheist of the Month. There's a $50 prize for the Atheist of the Month. So please be there. And there was one more question I wanted to ask. Just give me a minute. Hang on. And please do, if you're, I think like most of the people who are watching probably already know your channel, but if not, go to LPP's channel. It's a great channel. You'll hear wonderful discussions, and they're just what was the last question I wanted to ask you? It was something about, oh yeah, I just want to ask you, what do you want to say to the atheists who are watching, like who, they may, for whatever reason they're here. Maybe they're here just to poke at our faith. Maybe they're here because they're seeking the truth. Maybe they are looking for an answer. Maybe they already feel like they have the answer. For whatever motivation they're here, what would you say to them?
Well, I would say, at a minimum, go read Why Materialism is Baloney. It's a very interesting book and just completely obliterates the premise of materialism from both a philosophical and a scientific perspective. And now that book ends with the idealist's perspective, but at a minimum inserts the necessity of mind into the equation. And then I say from there, begin to actually contemplate the consciousness problem, the hard problem of consciousness, and the implications of what it means in relation to the materialist worldview. Because there's always caveats to this, but the vast majority of atheists are completely dependent on materialism. And if that is not true, and that's not the only thing that exists, then you have a very, very small worldview. And you are limiting yourself in relation to your understanding of existence. And the reason, one of the primary reasons I'm involved in all of this is after facing death myself and realizing that my mortality is, finite and it's very can be taken away at any second, right? Until you have faced those moments, it is very easy to dismiss a lot of this stuff. But obviously, as you get older, or you have those moments where your life is threatened, your worldview will begin to change. You will begin to ask those questions and to contemplate those things. And if you don't take the time to go beyond the talking points that are spewed by people in your camp, then you're never going to actually be analyzing whether or not your conclusion is the correct one. And ultimately, and I say this at the end of a lot of my shows, or something to this effect, we've all been given critical thinking skills. Some of us have different levels of talent in that perspective, but at the same time, we all have the ability to analyze things. And something I remember reading about was called thin slicing. And there's a great book called Blink on that topic. But basically, the analysis, what scientific analysis has shown us, is that our instinctual reaction and intuition is usually correct, and very often 90+% of the time. And in modern society, we've actually been conditioned to go against it and to look for all these reasons as to why our intuition and our instincts are wrong versus why they're right. And I would argue that since this has been the norm throughout all of history, that people have intuitively felt that there is a God, then perhaps you should be searching for the reasons why that would be the correct conclusion, rather than search for little, strings that say that there's no reason for it to exist. And actually go into analyzing these things with an open mind and say, I wonder which one of these is the more rational conclusion. And like I said, take the time and don't just regurgitate the same things over and over again, and many of which, as we were talking about tonight, are so outdated, it's almost laughable that they continue to be perpetuated.
Yeah, and I'll add to that too, that if you do seek that out and you realize that there's a creator, you'll be much better off because he loves you, and you're missing out by not knowing him. Knowing him is really the best thing in life. And people who do discover him, it changes your life. So it is a worthy pursuit. So, anyway, thank you so much for being here, John. It was so awesome to talk. Thank you all for all your chats and discussion. And God bless you all. Thanks.
Thanks so much.